Last week, we listened to Paul in his letter to the Ephesians remind us that a relationship with God in and through Christ comes with some perks. Grace and mercy, for instance. But it also comes with responsibility. Paul says it's not enough to just say that we know the love of God. We need to let that love we profess to know work in and through us so that others may come to see and know that love too. In this morning's readings, we hear once again that words are not enough. In the Song of Solomon, we hear as he describes God's love inviting us to turn from those things that otherwise focus our attention and seek a relationship with God. A relationship that brings new life, offers us joy. In the gospel, Jesus says that if we are in relationship with God, if God's love is truly that which permeates our very being, then what should be important to us is maintaining that relationship, not satisfying our human and worldly desires. And giving us a measure to use, Jesus makes it clear that how we live, how we relate to one another, matters. Because it reveals whether the love we profess to know is the love of God or the love of self. However, it is in the letter of James that this idea of how we live, how we relate to one another gets really unpacked. Believed to have been written by James, the brother of Jesus, this letter is written to a group of people who are scattered across the region. Following the death of Stephen, remember he is the first deacon of the new church, and the persecutions propagated by Rome and Jewish leadership, the followers of Jesus begin to disperse throughout the area in fear of their lives. Meeting in small groups, often in secret. These early followers did not want to publicly demonstrate their belief in Jesus as the Messiah. No surprise. How many of us would publicly show our faith if doing so might mean our death? Heck, many of us won't show our faith because we're afraid of being made fun of. But to these early followers, they had good reason to live in fear. Remember, before Paul becomes this great apostle, before he has his encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus, he was known as Saul. And he was one of those who had been empowered by Rome and the Sanhedrin to go out and hunt down these dissenters and turn them over to be executed for disrupting the good order and for professing someone other than Caesar to be God. Now, if that were the only reason the people hid their light under the bushel basket, James probably wouldn't have written this letter. Or at least it would have had a little different tone to it, okay? But as the persecutions subside, mind you, they don't really completely go away until the time of Constantine, almost 300 years later. The people had become so inwardly self-absorbed that outward demonstration of their relationship with God through Christ was almost non-existent. Even within the small groups that met, that gathered to worship together, what we would today call home churches, people had begun to worry more about their own safety, their own needs, than those they claimed to be in relationship with. And this dynamic resulted in communities where those who had started turning a blind eye to those who had not. Mostly out of a fear of scarcity. They began to protect what they had. Because if they shared it with somebody, when they needed it, they might not have it. As you might imagine, this disparity began to cause problems within these communities. Probably hurt feelings too. It is in light of these problems and a few others that James writes this letter, to remind them that if they are followers of Christ, then they have responsibilities that transcend the individual and really, truly encompass the wider body. James says to them, be doers of the word, not just hearers. Like Paul will one day say, James says that if all they do is claim for themselves the perks of being in relationship with God through Christ, without accepting the responsibilities that come with those perks, then what they really have is nothing. For James, grace, love that is not lived, is not really known. That's why he says later in his letter that faith without works is dead. Now that statement will come back and cause the church all kinds of trouble some 1,500 years later. Martin Luther will argue that James is professing some type of works righteousness, whereas Paul, who Martin really liked, is all about God's grace. Now if you didn't know, about 1500s, in the 1500s, was a period called the Reformation. And Martin Luther objected to a practice that had become entrenched in the Roman Church. A practice that said we could earn God's grace by the actions we do, or if we pay the church some indulgences. Like Paul, Martin believed that grace could only be known and experienced through faith. And for this reason, Martin argued that the letter of James should be stricken from the Bible. However, calmer heads prevailed. And looking at what James is saying, they came to the conclusion that Paul and James are basically saying the same thing. That is, faith reveals grace. And grace that is revealed engenders a response. Both Paul and James will say that in this response, we reveal the trueness of the love that we know. If the love we profess to know is transformative, in other words, if it guides us beyond ourselves in a way that helps us see the interconnectedness we have with one another, then it's God's love. If it's not, if it does not, then it's not. It's the love of self. And that type of love never brings about relationship. It's all about isolation. And for a people believed to be created to be in relationship with one another and with God, to ignore those around us is to ignore God's, well, at least one of God's deepest desires. That we love one another as God loves us. Such love's never easy. Partly because there are so many understandings of what that love looks like. As Christians, we profess a belief that the best representation of what this love looks like is revealed to us in the incarnation, life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. Everything else we believe falls short. Which means we fall short. Because we're not Christ. As members of the Episcopal Church, we believe that the best way that we can demonstrate this love that we know in a way that others might see it is spelled out for us in our baptismal covenant. A covenant that's all about relationship. All about finding, building, strengthening, and living in the relationships that we have with God and one another. Yet even here, our abilities fall way short of our aspirations. And that's why we say we can only show this love We can only live into the promises we make with God's help. With God's help. Not only do we strive to be in deeper relationship with God and those around us, we can become doers of the word, just as James encourages us. Here's the catch. We can't do either if all we do is sit back and do nothing. If we seek the perks without living into our responsibilities. I'm not suggesting that everyone here needs to be present to hand out food at every one of the mobile pantry events we have, or help us serve meals at Sienna Francis House once a month, or to give in support of the Bellevue Food Pantry. I'm not even saying that everyone here must help with Vacation Bible School, although I know our Christian Ed director would really appreciate it. I'm not saying we have to march with the church in the parade here in Bellevue, or even go on mission to Rosebud or South Dakota, or go to the Dominican Republic. But what I think James is telling us is that if we are followers of Christ, one responsibility we bear is that we are called to live out the faith and love we profess to know and have in whatever way we can. The challenge is taking that first step. Well, maybe it's the second. Possibly it's the third. The challenge is taking any step that takes us from where we are and moves us, guides us to where God is calling us to be. Good news? The good news is we don't take any step alone, but we do it with God's help. And that means whatever challenge we face along the way, as we strive to become doers of the word, are not our challenges alone. They're God's too. And as the gospel accounts remind us, there is no challenge so great that it cannot be overcome, because with God, all things are possible. Amen.